At my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law forced my husband and me to clean the tables. However, my husband took the microphone and publicly confronted her about the disrespectful demand. His unexpected action completely shifted the atmosphere of the entire reception. The morning sun cast long shadows across the modest suburban home where Eleanor and Frank Mitchell had lived for 43 years. Today was supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives. Their only son David was getting married. Eleanor stood before her bedroom mirror, carefully adjusting the simple navy dress she had purchased months ago for this special occasion. The fabric was nothing fancy, bought from a department store sale, but she had chosen it with care, wanting to look presentable for her son's wedding. Frank emerged from the bathroom, tugging at his tie with weathered hands that had spent decades working construction before his retirement. "You look beautiful, Ellie," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle affection of a man who had loved the same woman for nearly 5 decades. Eleanor smiled, though worry lines creased her forehead. She had been dreading this day as much as anticipating it, knowing that Jessica, their soon-to-be daughter-in-law, had never hidden her disdain for them. Jessica Hamilton came from old Connecticut money. Her family owned a chain of luxury hotels and had social connections that spanned generations. She had made it abundantly clear from the moment David introduced her to his parents that she considered them beneath her station. The subtle slights had begun immediately, the way she would speak about them as if they weren't in the room, her comments about David's settling for a small-town upbringing, and her obvious embarrassment when introducing them to her friends. Eleanor and Frank had endured it all in silence, not wanting to jeopardize their relationship with their son. The wedding was being held at the prestigious Grandview Country Club, a venue that Jessica had insisted upon despite David's initial protests about the cost. As their old Chevy truck pulled into the parking lot, filled with luxury sedans and sports cars, Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Frank reached over and squeezed her hand. "We belong here just as much as anyone else, Ellie. We're David's parents." They walked through the ornate entrance, past crystal chandeliers and marble columns that gleamed under soft lighting. The other guests were already mingling in the cocktail area, women in designer dresses and men in tailored suits that probably cost more than the Mitchells' monthly grocery budget. Eleanor noticed how conversations seemed to quiet as they passed, how eyes followed them with barely concealed curiosity, or worse, pity. Jessica appeared like a vision in white silk, her wedding dress no doubt costing more than most people's cars. She was surrounded by her bridesmaids, all perfectly coiffed and manicured, laughing at something one of them had said. When she spotted Eleanor and Frank approaching, her smile faltered for just a moment before returning, though it never reached her eyes. "Oh, Eleanor, Frank," she said, in that honey-sweet tone that Eleanor had learned to recognize as Jessica's version of condescension. "How quaint. I'm so glad you could make it." The pause before quaint was deliberate, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but managed a smile. "We wouldn't miss our son's wedding for anything," Frank replied firmly, his construction-hardened jaw set with quiet dignity. Jessica's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal, brittle and cold. "Of course not." "Well, you'll find your seats are marked. I do hope you'll be comfortable." With that dismissal, she turned back to her bridesmaids, immediately launching into animated conversation as if the Mitchells had simply vanished. The ceremony itself was beautiful, Eleanor had to admit. David looked handsome in his tuxedo, though she noticed he seemed nervous, his eyes darting frequently to Jessica rather than focusing on the moment. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, Eleanor felt a crazy urge to speak up. Not because she didn't want her son to be happy, but because she feared this marriage would only bring him pain. But she remained silent, as she always did. The reception began with the usual festivities, champagne toasts, elegant canapés, and a string quartet playing classical music. Eleanor and Frank had been seated at table 12, far from the wedding party and family tables, next to David's old college roommate and some distant relatives they barely knew. They accepted this slight without comment, though Eleanor noticed that Jessica's elderly grandmother had been given a place of honor at the head table, despite being in her 90s and barely able to participate in conversation. The real humiliation began during the dinner service. Jessica had risen from her seat at the head table, tapping her champagne flute with a silver spoon to get everyone's attention. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the radiant bride. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jessica began, her voice carrying clearly across the reception hall, "I want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate this wonderful day with David and me. This has truly been a perfect wedding, surrounded by family and friends who mean the world to us." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room before landing directly on Eleanor and Frank's table. Eleanor felt her blood chill at the calculating look in Jessica's eyes. "However," Jessica continued, her smile becoming razor-sharp, "I think it's important that we acknowledge the different roles people play in making an event like this successful. Some of us are here to celebrate, while others—" Her pause was deliberate, theatrical. "Others are here to serve. After all, everyone should contribute according to their abilities and station in life." The room had grown uncomfortably quiet. Eleanor felt as if every eye in the room was boring into her, and she wasn't wrong. Jessica was looking directly at them now, her meaning unmistakably clear. "Eleanor, Frank," Jessica called out sweetly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I think it would be wonderful if you could help us out. The catering staff seems a bit overwhelmed, and I'm sure you wouldn't mind lending a hand. After all, service work is something you're quite familiar with, isn't it?" The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Around them, guests began to murmur, some looking shocked, others embarrassed to witness such cruelty. Eleanor's face burned with humiliation as she looked toward David, desperate for her son to intervene. But David sat frozen, his face pale, saying nothing. "Come now," Jessica continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge when she noticed their hesitation. "There's no shame in honest work. I'm sure our guests would appreciate having their tables cleared and their glasses refilled. It's what you do, isn't it?" Frank's hands were clenched into fists under the table, but Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his arm. She couldn't bear to cause a scene at her son's wedding, couldn't be the reason his special day was ruined. With quiet dignity that belied her breaking heart, she stood up. "Of course, Jessica," Eleanor said softly, though her voice trembled slightly. "We'd be happy to help." And so began the most humiliating hour of Eleanor Mitchell's life. While the other guests watched in a mixture of horror and fascination, she and Frank were handed aprons by the clearly uncomfortable catering manager and directed to begin clearing tables. Jessica watched it all with barely concealed satisfaction, occasionally offering loud, helpful suggestions about which tables needed attention or reminding them not to forget to refill the water glasses. The elderly couple moved through the reception hall like ghosts, invisible to some guests who couldn't bear to watch, stared at by others who seemed mesmerized by the cruelty unfolding before them. Eleanor's arthritis made it difficult to carry the heavy trays, and Frank's back, weakened by years of construction work, screamed in protest as he bent to clear table after table. But the worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the public humiliation. It was looking up occasionally to see their son, their only child, sitting silently at the head table, allowing this degradation to continue. David's face was a mask of conflicted emotions, shame, fear, and something that might have been anger. But he said nothing, did nothing to defend the parents who had sacrificed everything to give him the education and opportunities that had led him to this very moment. The other guests' reactions ranged from uncomfortable silence to barely whispered disapproval, but no one intervened. This was high society, after all, where making a scene was considered far worse than witnessing one. Some of Jessica's friends seemed to find the spectacle entertaining, whispering among themselves and shooting amused glances at the working elderly couple. As Eleanor bent to clear a table near the dance floor, her arthritic hands shaking as she stacked the expensive china, she caught sight of her reflection in one of the hall's ornate mirrors. The woman looking back at her was bent with exhaustion and humiliation, wearing a server's apron over her carefully chosen dress, her gray hair coming loose from the simple style she had spent an hour perfecting that morning. For 43 years of marriage, through poverty and struggle, through David's childhood illnesses and Frank's work injuries, through every challenge life had thrown at them, Eleanor had maintained her dignity. She had raised her son to be respectful and kind, had worked double shifts at the diner to help pay for his college education, had sacrificed her own dreams so he could pursue his. And this public degradation at his wedding, was her reward. The weight of that realization, combined with the physical exhaustion and emotional devastation, finally broke something inside Eleanor Mitchell. As she stood there, surrounded by the laughter and celebration of people who saw her as nothing more than free labor, she felt something she had never experienced before, a burning, righteous anger that threatened to consume her entirely. It was 17-year-old Michael Hamilton, Jessica's own nephew, who first broke the terrible spell that had fallen over the reception. Michael had been watching the unfolding humiliation with growing disgust, his young face flushed with an anger that the adults around him seemed incapable of expressing. Unlike the other guests who averted their eyes or whispered behind their hands, Michael had been raised by parents who valued character over social standing, a lesson that apparently hadn't reached his Aunt Jessica. "This is disgusting," Michael said loudly, his voice carrying across several nearby tables. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that cut through the ambient conversation. Several guests turned to look at him, including Jessica, whose smile faltered for the first time that evening. "Michael, sit down," his mother hissed, tugging at his arm. But the teenager shook her off, his jaw set with the stubborn determination that runs in teenage blood. "No, Mom, this is wrong, and everyone here knows it." He looked directly at Jessica, his young voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "Aunt Jess, these are David's parents. They're your family now. How can you treat them like this?" Jessica's composure cracked slightly, but she quickly recovered, her smile returning, though it was noticeably strained. "Michael, darling, you're too young to understand. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about what? About basic human decency?" Michael's voice rose, and now most of the reception was openly staring. Eleanor, still holding a tray of dirty dishes, felt tears prick her eyes, not from continued humiliation, but from gratitude that at least one person in this room had found the courage to speak up for them. Frank moved closer to his wife, his weathered hand finding hers. They stood together, united in their dignity, despite everything that had been done to strip it away. The sight of them, this elderly couple, holding hands amid their public degradation, seemed to galvanize something in the room. The whispers grew louder, less discreet. People were beginning to take sides. "Michael, that's enough," Jessica said sharply, her mask of bridal sweetness finally slipping completely. "This is my wedding, and I won't have a child tell me how to run it." "Then maybe you should start acting like an adult instead of a spoiled brat," Michael shot back. The gasps from the crowd were audible now. David finally stirred from his paralysis, half rising from his seat, but Jessica's quick, sharp look made him sink back down. That's when Michael's father, Jessica's own brother Robert, stood up slowly. Robert Hamilton was a federal judge, a man accustomed to courtrooms and difficult decisions. He had remained silent during his daughter's outburst out of family loyalty, but watching his sister's cruelty had awakened something in him that he couldn't ignore. "Jessica," Robert said quietly, but his voice carried the authority of someone used to being heard. "This has gone far enough." "Robert, please," Jessica began, but her brother cut her off with a gesture. "No, Michael is right. This is unconscionable." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of other guests who had been complicit in their silence. "Eleanor and Frank Mitchell are David's parents. They deserve our respect, not our pity, and certainly not this public humiliation." The tide was beginning to turn. Other guests began to shift uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement with Robert's words. Eleanor felt the weight of the serving tray in her hands and, with a sudden surge of defiance, set it down on the nearest table with a decisive clink that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. "Thank you," she said simply, looking first at Michael, then at his father. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the hushed reception hall. "Thank you for reminding everyone that dignity isn't something you can buy or inherit. It's something you earn through how you treat others." But it was what happened next that would be talked about in social circles for years to come. As the tension in the room reached its breaking point, with Jessica looking frantically around for support that was rapidly evaporating, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Actually, I think there's something everyone should know about Jessica before we talk about who deserves respect in this room. The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, a slight man in his 30s who had been sitting quietly at one of the back tables. Most guests probably didn't even know who he was. He looked like just another wedding guest, unremarkable in his department store suit. But Eleanor noticed that Jessica's face went absolutely white when she saw him stand up. "Marcus," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here? You weren't invited." Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "No, I wasn't invited. But David was kind enough to add me to the guest list when I explained that I had some information about his bride that he might find interesting. Information that I think everyone here should hear." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. The simple action seemed to send Jessica into a panic. She looked desperately at David, who was staring at Marcus with growing confusion and alarm. "You see," Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent reception hall, "Jessica and I have a history. We were involved for about 2 years, right up until about 6 months ago, actually." He paused, letting that information sink in. "Even after she got engaged to David." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. David shot to his feet, his face a mixture of shock and growing rage. "What the hell are you talking about?" Marcus opened the envelope and pulled out what appeared to be photographs and documents. "I'm talking about the fact that your new wife, has been leading a double life. These photos were taken at the Meridian Hotel downtown. I believe you'll recognize the woman in them, David, though you might be surprised by her companion." He held up several photographs, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see they showed Jessica in compromising positions with a man who was clearly not David. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. "That's not all," Marcus continued, clearly enjoying his moment of revenge. "Jessica, would you like to tell everyone about the prenuptial agreement you had your lawyer draw up? The one that gives you half of David's inheritance from his grandfather immediately upon marriage, and the rest if he dies within the first 5 years?" Eleanor felt Frank's hand tighten on hers. David's grandfather had left him a substantial trust fund, nearly $2 million, that would have set him up for life. If what Marcus was saying was true, or maybe you'd prefer to discuss the insurance policies you took out on David's life just last month. 3 different policies, totaling $5 million, with yourself as the sole beneficiary? The room was in complete chaos now. Guests were standing, pointing, shouting questions. Jessica was backing away from the head table, her face a mask of terror and rage. David looked as if he might collapse, the full horror of what he was hearing finally sinking in. "You're lying!" Jessica screamed, but her voice cracked with desperation rather than conviction. "He's making this all up. David, you know I love you." Marcus laughed coldly. "Love? Jessica, you told me just 3 weeks ago that you couldn't wait for this pathetic loser to have an accident so you could inherit his money and we could finally be together." "I have recordings, Jessica. Hours of them." He pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. Jessica's voice filled the room, crystal clear and unmistakably hers. "David is such an idiot. He actually believes I love him. Once we're married and I get access to his trust fund, we can arrange something permanent. His family has a history of heart problems, after all. It wouldn't be that suspicious if he had a sudden cardiac event during our honeymoon." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt sick to her stomach, not just from what she was hearing, but from the realization of how close her son had come to marrying this monster. Frank's face was white with rage, and she could feel him trembling beside her. David stood frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and finally, a rage so pure and cold that it transformed his features entirely. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent room. "Get out." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of absolute finality. "Get out of my sight before I do something I'll regret." Jessica looked around wildly, searching for support, for someone to defend her, but found only faces filled with disgust and horror. Even her own family members were staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. "David, please, let me explain," she began, but he cut her off. "Explain what? How you plan to murder me for money? How you've been cheating on me throughout our entire engagement? How you just humiliated my parents? the two people who sacrificed everything to give me the life that made me attractive to you in the first place." His voice rose with each word, and Eleanor had never been prouder of her son than in that moment. Finally, he was standing up for what was right. What happened next was like watching a dam burst. 2 years of suppressed anger, humiliation, and frustration came pouring out of David all at once. He turned to face the room full of guests, his voice shaking with emotion. "I want everyone to see what I've been too blind to see for the past 2 years. This woman, this creature standing in a wedding dress that cost more than my parents make in 6 months, just forced my mother and father to serve drinks and clear tables at their own son's wedding. She did it because she thinks they're beneath her, because they're working-class people who raised their son with love instead of money." He walked over to where Eleanor and Frank stood, still wearing their servers' aprons, and gently untied them himself. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes about the man they had raised. "My parents," David continued, his voice growing stronger, "worked multiple jobs to put me through college. My mother cleaned office buildings at night after working at the diner all day. My father destroyed his back in construction work, taking overtime shifts to pay for my books and housing. They never took a vacation, never bought themselves anything nice, because every dollar they earned went toward giving me opportunities they never had." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time that day, they weren't tears of humiliation. "And this is how I repaid them," David said, his voice breaking. "By standing silent while the woman I thought I loved treated them like servants at what should have been one of the happiest days of their lives." He turned to Jessica, who was still backing toward the exit, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender. "You want to know about class, Jessica? About what makes someone worthy of respect? It's not money or family connections or designer clothes. It's character. It's integrity. It's the ability to treat all people with dignity, regardless of their station in life. And by that measure, my parents are worth 1,000 of you." The crowd had fallen completely silent again, hanging on every word. Eleanor noticed that many of the guests were looking ashamed, perhaps thinking about their own complicity in what had transpired. "You're right about one thing, though," David continued. "My parents do know about service. They know about serving their family, their community, and their principles. They know about the kind of service that builds character instead of tearing it down." He looked directly at Eleanor and Frank, his eyes filled with tears of regret and love. "Mom, Dad, I am so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't defend you immediately. I'm sorry I let fear and weakness keep me silent while you were humiliated. I'm sorry it took a stranger's revelation about my wife's true nature to give me the courage to do what I should have done the moment she opened her mouth." Frank stepped forward and placed a weathered hand on his son's shoulder. "Son," he said quietly, "we've all made mistakes. What matters is what you do now." That's when Jessica made her final desperate play. Perhaps realizing that her plans were completely destroyed, that her reputation was in ruins, and that her meal ticket was disappearing, she decided to go down swinging. "You think you're so noble?" she screamed at David, her composure completely shattered. "You think your precious parents are so wonderful? Your father is nothing but a broken-down construction worker, and your mother smells like grease from that disgusting diner. They're embarrassing. I was doing you a favor by putting them in their place." The words hung in the air like poison, but instead of the silence that had greeted her earlier cruelties, this time the reaction was immediate and visceral. The crowd didn't just disapprove, they were genuinely angry. "That's enough," Robert Hamilton said sharply, moving toward his sister. "Jessica, you're done. Security will escort you out." "No," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice cutting through the chaos. Everyone turned to look at her, surprised. She had been silent through most of the confrontation, but now she stepped forward, her spine straight, her chin held high. "Let her finish," Eleanor said calmly. "Let everyone hear exactly what kind of person she really is. Let there be no doubt in anyone's mind about her character." She looked directly at Jessica, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet strength of someone who had endured decades of hardship with grace. "You're right, Jessica. I do smell like grease sometimes, because I work in a kitchen feeding people honest food for honest wages. My husband's hands are rough and scarred because he built things, homes where families could live, schools where children could learn, hospitals where people could heal. We're proud of that work, proud of the life we built together, proud of the son we raised. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. But you? What have you built? What have you created besides schemes and lies? What legacy will you leave besides the memory of your cruelty? Eleanor stepped closer to Jessica, close enough that her next words were clearly meant just for her ears, though in the silence of the room, everyone could hear them. I pity you, she said simply. Not because you'll face consequences for what you've done tonight, but because you'll have to live with the knowledge of what you are for the rest of your life. Money can buy a lot of things, Jessica, but it can't buy back your soul. The aftermath of Jessica's exposure unfolded with the swift brutality that only high society can deliver when one of their own falls from grace. Within minutes of Eleanor's devastating final words, Jessica found herself completely isolated in a room full of people who had, just hours earlier, been celebrating her wedding. Robert Hamilton, his judicial training taking over, immediately took charge of the situation. Marcus, he said firmly, I'm going to need copies of everything you have, the photographs, the recordings, the insurance documents. This is now a criminal matter. Marcus nodded, clearly prepared for this request. I've already contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. They'll want to speak with David about the insurance policies and the timing of the prenuptial agreement. This appears to be a clear case of conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain. Jessica's face went from white to green. The full weight of her situation was finally hitting her. This wasn't just a social scandal that would blow over with time. She was looking at serious federal charges. This is insane, she screamed, but her voice had lost all of its earlier authority. Now she just sounded desperate and shrill. You can't prove anything. It's all circumstantial. Actually, Marcus said calmly, pulling out his phone, I have about 6 hours of recorded conversations where you discuss various methods of killing David and making it look accidental. You were surprisingly detailed in your planning, Jessica. The authorities will find it very interesting. David, meanwhile, had moved to stand beside his parents. The transformation in him was remarkable. Gone was the uncertain man who had sat silently while his wife humiliated his parents. In his place stood someone who had finally found his backbone. Dad, Mom, he said quietly, I need you to know that this marriage is over. Not just because of what we learned tonight, but because of what happened earlier. Even if Jessica had been faithful, even if she hadn't been planning to kill me, I could never forgive what she did to you both. Eleanor reached up and touched her son's cheek gently. We know, sweetheart. We know. Frank clapped his son on the shoulder with one of his weathered hands. Takes a big man to admit when he's wrong, son. Bigger man to make it right. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that Marcus had indeed been in contact with law enforcement. Several uniformed police officers entered the reception hall, followed by 2 detectives in plain clothes. The surreal scene of a bride being read her Miranda rights in a wedding dress would be seared into the memories of everyone present for years to come. Jessica Marie Hamilton, the lead detective announced, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked around Jessica's wrists, she looked around the room one final time, perhaps hoping for some last-minute rescue or support. Instead, she found only faces filled with disgust, disappointment, or in some cases, grim satisfaction. Even her own parents had turned away, unable to look at what their daughter had become. The guests began to disperse, but not before many of them approached Eleanor and Frank to offer apologies and support. People who had stood silently by during their humiliation now seemed eager to distance themselves from their earlier complicity. Mrs. Mitchell, said a woman in an expensive blue dress, I am so sorry for what happened earlier. What Jessica did was unconscionable. We all should have spoken up, added another guest. There's no excuse for what we allowed to happen. Eleanor accepted these apologies with grace, though Frank was less forgiving. Funny how everyone finds their voice after the truth comes out, he muttered, loud enough for several guests to hear. The comment hit its mark. Several people looked genuinely ashamed as they made their exits. In the days that followed the wedding debacle, something unexpected happened. The story of Eleanor and Frank's dignity in the face of public humiliation and Eleanor's powerful final confrontation with Jessica had spread throughout the local community and beyond. What had been intended as their moment of greatest shame had instead become a testament to their character. 3 days after the wedding, Eleanor received a phone call at the diner where she worked. The caller introduced himself as James Morrison, owner of Morrison Hospitality Group, which operated several upscale restaurants in the area. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "I heard about what happened at the Hamilton wedding. I want you to know that your grace under pressure and your dignity in that situation impressed a lot of people, including me. I'm opening a new restaurant next month, and I'd like to offer you the position of head chef. The salary would be triple what you're making now, plus full benefits." Eleanor was stunned. "Mr. Morrison, I don't understand." "I'm just a diner cook." "No, ma'am," he interrupted firmly. "You're a woman of character who knows how to handle herself under pressure. Those are the kinds of people I want working for me. Your cooking skills are just a bonus. I had lunch at your diner yesterday, and the food was excellent." Similar opportunities began opening up for Frank as well. Word of his quiet dignity and his years of skilled construction work led to offers from several contractors who valued reliability and integrity over flashy credentials. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: Harvard University, David's alma mater. The university had heard about the Mitchell family's story and invited Eleanor and Frank to be guest speakers at their next graduation ceremony, to talk about the values that truly matter in life. "We want our graduates to understand that success isn't just about what you achieve," the dean explained during his phone call to Eleanor, "but about how you treat others along the way. Your story embodies the kind of character we hope to instill in our students." David threw himself into making amends for his failures as a son. The day after Jessica's arrest, he drove to his parents' modest home and found them in their small backyard garden, tending to the tomatoes and peppers they grew every summer. "I don't know how to begin apologizing," he said without preamble, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed you both in every way possible." Eleanor set down her watering can and looked at her son with the same loving eyes she had when he was a little boy with scraped knees and hurt feelings. "David, we're not looking for apologies. We're looking for our son to come home." What followed was the most honest conversation the three of them had ever had. David spoke about the gradual way Jessica had isolated him from his family, how she had slowly convinced him that his parents were holding him back, how she had made him ashamed of his humble origins. Eleanor and Frank listened without judgment, recognizing the classic patterns of emotional manipulation and control. "She made me believe that love meant choosing between her and you," David admitted. "I see now that real love doesn't ask you to abandon the people who raised you." Frank, never one for many words, summed it up simply: "Son, anyone who asks you to choose between them and your family isn't worth choosing." David quit his job at the prestigious law firm where Jessica's connections had gotten him hired, despite the significant pay cut this meant. Instead, he joined a legal aid clinic, using his skills to help working-class families navigate the legal system, people like his parents who often couldn't afford quality representation. "I want to use my education the way you always hoped I would," he told his parents. "To help people, not just to make money." The healing between David and his parents didn't happen overnight, but it was genuine. They began having Sunday dinners together again, something they hadn't done since David started dating Jessica. Eleanor cooked her son's favorite meals, pot roast and mashed potatoes, nothing fancy, but made with love, while Frank taught David how to fix things around the house, skills his son had never learned while pursuing his white-collar career. Jessica's downfall and legal consequences. Jessica's legal troubles mounted quickly. The FBI's investigation revealed an even more extensive pattern of fraud than initially suspected. She had taken out additional life insurance policies on David through different companies, using forged documents and false information. The total amount she would have received from his death was nearly $8 million. Her affair with Marcus Chen turned out to be just one of several relationships she had maintained throughout her engagement to David. Investigators found evidence of at least 3 other men she had been seeing, each of whom she had told different lies about her intentions and circumstances. The prenuptial agreement she had insisted David sign was found to be fraudulent as well, filled with legal language designed to give her immediate access to his trust fund while providing him with no protection if the marriage failed. Her lawyer, it turned out, had been aware of her deceptive intentions and was now facing disbarment proceedings. But perhaps the most damaging evidence came from her own family. Faced with the reality of their daughter's crimes, Jessica's parents cooperated fully with the investigation. They revealed that she had been stealing money from the family business for years, using her access to company accounts to fund her lavish lifestyle. "We knew something was wrong," her mother admitted during a tearful interview with investigators. "Jessica had expensive tastes that her job couldn't support, but we thought maybe David was helping her financially. We never imagined she was stealing from us." The social consequences were swift and merciless. Jessica's wealthy friends abandoned her completely, unwilling to be associated with someone facing such serious criminal charges. The country club revoked her family's membership. Society pages that had once featured her at charity events now covered her legal troubles with the same enthusiasm they had once reserved for her fashion choices. Marcus Chen, despite his role in exposing Jessica's crimes, faced his own legal troubles for his part in the affair and for initially helping her plan David's murder before developing cold feet. However, his cooperation with authorities earned him a plea deal that would result in probation rather than prison time. The story of the Hamilton wedding became legendary in their Connecticut community, but not in the way Jessica had intended when she planned her lavish celebration. Instead of being remembered as the social event of the season, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of valuing wealth and status over character and human decency. Local newspapers picked up the story, and it eventually made national news as an example of how social media and instant communication could turn a private moment of cruelty into a public reckoning. The contrast between Jessica's entitled arrogance and Eleanor's dignified response resonated with people across the country who had experienced their own moments of class-based discrimination. Eleanor began receiving letters from strangers who had heard her story. Working-class parents who had felt looked down upon by their children's more affluent in-laws, service workers who had been treated dismissively by wealthy customers, ordinary people who had been made to feel small by those who considered themselves superior. One letter, from a hotel housekeeper in Chicago, particularly touched her. "Mrs. Mitchell, I saw your story on the news, and I wanted to thank you for showing that dignity isn't something that can be taken away from you. It's something you carry inside yourself. The way you handled that horrible woman gave me strength to stand up for myself when my supervisor tried to make me work a double shift without overtime pay." The diner where Eleanor worked became something of a pilgrimage site, with people driving from neighboring towns just to meet the woman whose grace under fire had captured the nation's attention. Eleanor handled the attention with the same quiet dignity she had shown during her ordeal, always making time to speak with visitors while never allowing the attention to go to her head. "I'm not a hero," she would tell reporters who came to interview her. "I'm just someone who was raised to treat all people with respect and to expect the same in return. What happened at that wedding wasn't about me. It was about the kind of society we want to live in." 6 months after the disastrous wedding, the Mitchell family had settled into a new and much happier normal. Eleanor was thriving in her new position as head chef at Morrison's Bistro, where her down-to-earth cooking style and warm personality had made the restaurant a local favorite. Food critics praised her authentic comfort food, elevated to fine dining without losing its soul. Frank had started his own small construction company, specializing in home repairs and renovations for elderly clients who appreciated his honesty and careful workmanship. Word of mouth had given him more business than he could handle, and he was considering hiring an assistant, something he never could have imagined during his years working for other contractors. David's work at the legal aid clinic had given him a sense of purpose he had never felt during his years at the corporate law firm. He was representing families facing eviction, workers dealing with wage theft, and immigrants navigating the citizenship process, using his privileged education to help people who reminded him of his parents. The three of them had grown closer than they had been since David's childhood. The trauma of Jessica's betrayal and the public humiliation had, paradoxically, strengthened their family bond by stripping away the pretenses and social pressures that had been driving them apart. "It's funny," Eleanor mused one Sunday evening as they sat on the back porch after dinner, watching the sunset through the trees. "I wouldn't wish what happened to us on anyone, but I'm almost grateful for it. It showed us what really matters." Frank nodded, puffing on his pipe, a habit he had given up years earlier but recently resumed. "Sometimes you need to lose your way to find your way back home." David, sitting on the porch steps with a legal brief in his lap, looked up at his parents with a mixture of love and regret. "I just wish it hadn't taken something so awful to open my eyes." "The important thing," Eleanor said gently, "is that your eyes are open now." Jessica Hamilton's story, meanwhile, had taken a very different trajectory. After pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and multiple counts of fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence, she was serving 12 years in federal prison. The woman who had once looked down on service workers was now working in the prison laundry, earning 23 cents an hour and learning what real humility felt like. Her wealthy friends had not only abandoned her, but actively worked to erase any trace of their previous association with her. Photos were removed from social media, her name was struck from charity board rosters, and her membership in various exclusive organizations was quietly revoked. The Hamilton family fortune, built over generations, was severely damaged by the legal costs of Jessica's defense and the restitution she was ordered to pay to her victims. Her parents, once pillars of Connecticut society, had become pariahs in their own social circles. Perhaps most tellingly, the Grandview Country Club, where the fateful wedding had taken place, implemented new policies requiring all events to include clear provisions for treating service staff with respect and dignity. A plaque in the main dining room, installed 6 months after the incident, read, "Hospitality is not just about serving others, but about recognizing the humanity in everyone who serves." It was an ironic memorial to a woman who had confused wealth with worth and had paid the ultimate price for that confusion on the 1-year anniversary of what the local newspapers had dubbed the wedding day reckoning. Eleanor found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed. She was preparing for another busy evening at the restaurant, chopping vegetables for the evening special, her famous pot roast, elevated with wine reduction and fresh herbs, but still recognizably the comfort food she had been making for decades. A young reporter from the local paper had called earlier, wanting to do a follow-up story on how the family was doing a year later. Eleanor had agreed to the interview, though she still felt uncomfortable with the attention her story continued to generate. "What would you want people to learn from your experience?" the reporter had asked. Eleanor had thought for a long moment before answering. "I suppose I'd want them to understand that you can't judge a person's worth by their bank account or their job title or the neighborhood they live in. Real class, the kind that matters, comes from how you treat other people, especially people who can't do anything for you in return." She paused, thinking about Jessica sitting in her prison cell, probably still wondering how her carefully laid plans had gone so wrong. "And I'd want them to know that cruelty always comes back to you eventually. Maybe not right away, maybe not in the way you expect, but it always comes back. Kindness works the same way. It comes back to you multiplied." As Eleanor finished her prep work and prepared for another busy evening serving meals to people from all walks of life, she felt a deep sense of contentment. She had learned that sometimes the worst moments in your life can lead to the best ones, and that dignity is something that no one can take away from you unless you let them. The wedding that was supposed to be the beginning of Jessica's perfect life had instead become the end of her reign of cruelty and the beginning of the Mitchell family's redemption. In the end, Eleanor thought with satisfaction, justice had indeed been served, and it tasted sweeter than any dish she had ever prepared.